All right, yesterday, the last 2 days, in fact, we have talked about anthropocentrism, radical anthropocentrism, which really is an erroneous way of understanding anthropology, or what it means to be a human being. I think, and it's not unique with me, but many people who have studied this area much more than I have studied it will say that the way we understand who we are as human beings is really the basis of everything. Everything. In the phrase we often use when we talk about social justice, peace, and integrity of creation, almost as if integrity of creation is an afterthought, or at least an add-on. I think integrity of the creation is the foundation of all kind of peace, every kind of peace or justice. Social justice depends upon integrity of creation, because what is social justice if not a fair and equitable distribution of the goods of earth? What is racial justice? An acknowledgement and appreciation of the differences in human race, which is a result of earth. I mean, everything is a result of earth, and how we understand ourselves as creatures of earth and our place in the bigger picture is what anthropology is all about. And I said at the beginning, I say again, we have new insights now, exciting new insights about the cosmos, about creation, about our place in the universe, frightening new insights as well. Not frightening that it's going to hurt us. It hasn't hurt us yet. I mean, the fact that our ancestors used to think that the sun revolves around the earth didn't cause anybody any harm. They just had to change that, which is always difficult to change when we are forced to change understanding who we are. And as I said, every dynamic new insight into science has forced us to understand ourselves and our religion, which means our relationship with God, in a new way. And that's exciting. Exciting. But again, frightening. Frightening because we're not sure, what does that mean about our relationship with God? What if, as cosmologists say, there was no period of perfection before the Big Bang? What do we do with the story of the Garden of Eden? But then if you read carefully the story of the Garden of Eden, it never says it's perfect. We've read into that story. But you see, and it all comes down, I know I speak explicitly from a biblical perspective, how we have understood our biblical stories. And little by little, we are getting new insights into them. And why new insights? Because something happens in society. Something happens in the world. Just be glad we are not in that era, if there is going to be one, when we discover that there is intelligent life living on another planet. Then we're going to have to really reinterpret what Christology means. Or remember what Lynn White said. Either get a new religion or look at the old one in a new way. And I also pointed out, Pope Francis did say, look at the other one in a new way. We need a new way of thinking. So, yesterday I talked about one way that the biblical tradition presents to us an understanding of anthropology anthropology, in the image of God, which is, again, I want to say, it's a beautiful image, and how privileged we are to understand ourselves like that. And I shouldn't even say that, how privileged we are to be creatures like that, as our tradition insists. But it's a very, very good story. These people were very, very astute, realizing, the people being, of course, people who had struggled with monarchy. Monarchy, which they realized if we don't do it, we will not survive. And if we do it, we may be moving against and living against our religious tradition. So what did they do? They reinterpreted the religious tradition and also monarchy. But the story reminds us, if you want to think of that as original sin, not original in the terms of first, but original in the terms of basic, fundamental to being a human being, an acknowledgement what a spectacular creature we are as image of God. However, so often it goes to our head. And instead of thinking of ourselves as image of God, we want to be gods. That's a contemporary story, that ancient story. And it's contemporary because it is so fundamental to what it means to be a human being, to what anthropology tells us about our struggle in being full human beings. So that's one way of understanding. And again, it came out of Israel's experience of struggling with monarchy. Because it is in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, we know it's not history. First 11 chapters of Genesis have almost no historical details. When we begin in chapter 12, then there's historical details, but it's always interpretive history, which is, of course, what history is, interpretation from somebody's point of view. Today I want to talk about the second creation story, which is a very different story, but it has some of the same elements because it comes from the same people who are struggling with what does it mean to be a human being. Now, it's not a story about seals. It's not a story about corn cobs. But it is a story about a garden. And that should tell us it comes from agricultural people. And so the stories and the reality of their life comes out of their experience. The experience of being agricultural people, yet somehow or other struggling with some of the realities of what it means to be a human being. And it is a story that reflects much of what you and I have experienced in an entirely different historical context. So let's take a look then at Genesis 2. Genesis 1, very interesting, began with the cosmos. If you look at the order of creation, it started in the heavens, and then it moved all the way down to the earth and the creation of the animals in the water and on earth and human beings. Genesis 2 does not start that way. In the day when the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. The focus here is not the heavens. The focus is the earth. Now don't ask the question, well, when were the heavens created? Whoever's telling this story is not interested in the heavens, in the same way as the one who told the other story. We do that sometimes with biblical stories. We want the biblical authors to answer our questions, to address what we want. And so we add to the biblical story. He must have been drinking, and I always want to stand up and shout, how do you know? But I don't. In the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens, now notice, when no plant of the field was yet on the earth, and no herb of the field had yet sprung up. Why? For the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was no one to till the ground. Now, anyone who knows anything about farming knows that you can do nothing unless God does God's part and human beings do theirs. And that tells us something about the cooperation, understood. Life and fertility and fruitfulness of the earth depends on the cooperation between God and human beings. Good farming ethics. But a stream would rise from the earth and water the whole face of the earth. And then the Lord God formed, and formed means forming with hands. So the characterization of God, of course, is of a potter. I'm sure you all know, this is such a familiar story, so it's a very interesting characterization of God. The Lord God formed man. My translation says man. The Hebrew says the man. From the dust of the ground. Now in Hebrew, there are 4 words for man that we translate man. One of them is Adam, which of course we know. It's the fundamental one. It simply means human being. Another one is Enosh. Enosh means weak, limited human beings. Not sinful, just weak and limited. In other words, you can't fly. You jump off, out of the barn, you go down, you don't go up. It's limited in that sense. And we find that throughout the Old Testament when they want to remind human beings, who do you think you are? All right? The third one is giver. Giver means strong man. So we've got one word that means weak, limited, and it's masculine. Like it or not, it's masculine. One means weak, and the other is strong man. Sometimes translated warrior or soldier, because strong man. That's the word that is used in the book of Job, when God says to Job, gird yourself like a giver. In other words, get ready, buddy. You want to take me on? Then arm yourself. You got to be strong to face God in any kind of confrontation. And the fourth word is ish. And ish means man in relationship. Usually, not always, but usually with a woman. So that word is sometimes translated as husband. That word will also appear in the story. But throughout the story, the word is ha'adam. Now again, I said yesterday that the stories came down to us primarily, or at least initially, in oral form. So there's a tremendous amount of rhyming. You and I still have elements of oral tradition or oral culture in our upbringing. Children, of course, are a perfect example of oral culture. They hear things, and they rhyme things. But in an oral culture, it is very important because memory is so important. We don't use our memories. We don't have to use our memories. We have libraries. And now all you have to do is know how to use your index finger and push the right button, and everything appears on the screen. Of course, you got to remember where the screen is, but we don't use our memories. I remember somebody once told me that they knew an Arab who knew the Quran by heart. That boggles my imagination. An anthropologist friend of mine, colleague, was a missionary in Sierra Leone. And he said that it was not uncommon when the people would get together for major ceremonies to celebrate, and everybody from the tribe would come. And these people are an oral tradition, that there's always at least one or two in the community who have the better or the best memories, and they become the storytellers. They become the genealogists. All right? And genealogies always change, not because people forget, but they always adjust it a little bit, depending upon who the audience is. The Tony said that many times he was at a celebration where the genealogist or the storyteller would get up and tell the story of the people for at least 18 hours. that boggles the imagination. And why? Because we are a literate culture. And we think that the opposite of literate is illiterate. No. The opposite of literate is oral. And the difference between an oral culture and a literate culture is where you keep your traditions. A literate culture keeps the traditions in literature. An oral culture keeps the tradition in memory. And not just one memory, the memory of the people. Because once again, just like a child who is hearing a bedside story that he or she knows, allows you to make adjustments, but not important ones, because they are an oral culture. They use that when they go to school and learn. Isn't that funny? All right. So what we have here, remember, this is an oral culture. So I'm going to use some Hebrew language. You know the story well enough to know what I'm talking about here. Then the Lord God formed Ha'adam from the dust of Adamah. You hear the connection. Adam is man from Adamah. You hear the connection. All right? And both words come from the same root, which is very interesting because linguistically, the man comes from the ground. And in the story, the man comes from the ground. We're talking about interconnectedness. Now we know in a sophisticated science, now we may not really come from the ground, but we are made up of the same stuff as ground. So these people who were ancient, creative thinkers, were not so far from science. And of course, why did they tell their story in that way? In a certain sense, again, agricultural people identify with the farmland. It's their life. But more than that, life goes back, or living things go back to the ground. So it must be then that that's where they came from. The Lord God formed Adam from the dust of Adamah and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. In other words, God blew him up, like you blow up a balloon. And Adam became a living being. Now, in the Hebrew, that phrase, living being, nefesh, the animals also are living beings, and they have, in a certain sense, the breath of life. So don't expect a creative story to be logically consistent, as we like to have things logically consistent. So that's the creation of the man. I continue. Out of Adamah, he then the Lord God made to grow every tree. Trees are made of the same stuff. Talk about interconnectedness. We do that sometimes when we bake and we've got dough left over and we make something else. It's almost it's the same kind of a kind of story. Not that there was dirt left over, right? But it's made of the same stuff. Out of Adamah, the Lord God made to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. Notice that is focusing on the value of the tree, pleasant to the sight. We see it. It touches our sensitivities, our creativity, and we feed from it. So the tree has value for human beings. Now what we have to be careful of when we today, we think of the goodness of the natural world. Realize that goodness is not, and value is not simply instrumental. By that I mean it is good because it does some good to us. That's instrumental. It is. It does good for us. But whether it does good for us or not, it has its own intrinsic value. And so people make a distinction between instrumental value and intrinsic value. If we think that the only value elements of the natural world have is value that benefits us, that is radical anthropocentrism. It has value in itself. Again, think of how often you and I say, this isn't worth anything. Of course it is. What we should be saying is, I find no value in this. I find no value in this. It does not value me. It is not valuable to me. That does not mean it's not valuable. And I said before, as I was referring to the mosquito, if it didn't have value, it would not have been created. Someplace, and I'm sure that, bug specialists would be able to tell us the value in the entire ecosystem of the mosquito, right? But, they all have value, not only in themselves, but in themselves as part of the ecosystem. If it's in our ecosystem, it has value. And the problem may be that we don't recognize it. Or it may not have value to us. We can't use it. So out of Adamah, the Lord God made to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. The tree of life also in the midst of the garden. So the tree of life is the tree in the midst of the garden. And an addition, and most Old Testament scholars say that in the story, the original story did not need the second tree, because it's a story of creation. It needs the tree of life, perhaps, but it does not need the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And even as you read the translation, and I'm going to read the sentence, it sounds like the phrase itself is an addition. Every tree that is, the Lord God made to grow, every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food, the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's an addition. It's necessary for the story in Genesis 3. It's not necessary for the story of creation. A river runs out of Eden to water the garden. It goes on about the four major rivers of the world coming from the stream out of the garden in Eden. And if you look at a map, the four major rivers of the world do not come together. That's not the point. The Tigris and Euphrates, excuse me. And the four rivers are, the name of the first is Pishon. It's the one that flows through the whole of the land of Havilah, and that's probably Egypt, where there is gold. And the other river, the second river, is Gihon, which flows from Cush. Cush is Africa. The name of the third river is the Tigris, and the name of the fourth river is the Euphrates. Now, the Tigris and the Euphrates, of course we know, come together in Mesopotamia. But the other four rivers, the other two rivers, are not connected. So the point is to say that nourishment and life come from Eden to all of the world through the water. That's the creation of the man and the interconnectedness of the man with the trees. But it goes on. I'm skipping over at this point. Well, I won't. The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to till it and keep it. Those two verbs are very, very telling. The Hebrew word for till is also translated other places as serve. Very interesting for a story about agriculture. You serve the land. Tilling is serving the land. And if you look at that translation, I'm going to use that translation, till and serve. That is not domination. And once again, the story itself tells us that the agricultural people realized that in very real sense, they were servants of the land. They served the land. They brought forth, but they served the land. So again, the story comes out of the experience of the people. The Lord God commanded the man, "You may freely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you may not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall die." Okay, you see how that's important for the story in 3. Then the Lord God said, "It is not good that the man should be alone." Now the Hebrew word for alone, translated, means over and against himself. Not all there. Not simply lonely. Not complete. Literally, not all there. "I will make for him," now this translation says helper. Helper suggests subordination. Does not suggest equal. It suggests subordination. That's a translation is always interpretation. It's a translation. If you did a word study in the entire Old Testament, you would find that word used frequently, almost always. God, the Hebrew word is Eitzer. God is the Eitzer. So this is a biased translation. Usually the word means source of blessing, because God is the source of blessing. So what the author is saying, I will make him a source of blessing as his partner. Now, again, we got that not simply because of feminist interpretation, but also a more accurate translation of the Hebrew. I will make for him a source of blessing as his partner. So out of the ground, what does the Lord make? Out of the ground, the Lord God formed every animal of the field, every bird of the air, and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. So it's not good for the man to be alone. I'll make him a partner. So God makes the animals. Now you can run with that any way you want. The point I want to make is, of course, made of the same stuff. The commonality, the interconnectedness. No wonder Francis refers to elements of the natural world as brother and sister. In a very real scientific way, they are. So, the next time you swat a fly or step on, ants, and I use it in an exaggerated way, but seriously, the elements of creation are literally our brothers and sisters. If you want to use, those are beautiful, beautiful metaphors, but we are connected with them intimately. Intimately, because of our origin, we are connected with elements of the natural world because of our origin and our survival. And again, Pope Francis speaks about this all the time. He uses that word interconnected all the time. And he certainly does describe interconnectedness. And whenever the man called every creature, that was its name. The man had power because the man could name. The man gave names to all the cattle, to the birds of the air, and every animal of the field. But for the man, there was found no source of blessing, no Eitzer as his partner. And then we have the creation of the woman, which again has been traditionally very misunderstood. The movement of feminism has forced us to look at it in a new way, and not moving away from the text, being faithful to what the text says. So much the text never says certain things that, any more than the text says, you can do what you want with the elements of nature. It never says that. So the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and he slept. And the word all the way through is Adam. And then he took one of his ribs and closed up its place with flesh. There used to be a Hallmark card with the saying that when God made Eve, he did not take a bone from Adam's foot because he was not supposed to walk all over her. He did not take a bone from Adam's hand because she was not meant to do all of his work. He took a bone from a rib near the heart because she was supposed to be his lover. Let me just say, I think that's really clever. But I doubt that's what the original author intended. But it's a good feminist interpretation, or a cute feminist interpretation. Took one from his rib. I remember when I was a candidate, if you of those remember, candidate in the basement of the Motherhouse. And Sister Gerald was our teacher for general science. And I remember as candidates, we sat in front seats, always. And to the right, I'm quite sure it was to the right because the windows were to the left. To the right was a skeleton, Oscar. Do you remember Oscar, the skeleton? And I remember as a candidate looking at that skeleton thinking, that cannot be a man's skeleton because he's got as many ribs on one side as he has on the other. And I remember asking Sister Gerald about that, and all she did was look at me. Now, I read that story literally. Nobody said it's a metaphor. He took the rib, closed it up in its place, and with the rib the Lord had taken from the man, he made her, he constructed her. My dissertation director said he built her, which is a good translation of that. And when he looked at her, he said, she is well built. He made into a woman and brought her to the man. All right? Then the man said, this is bone of, at last, bone of my bones comes from me, flesh of my flesh. She shall be called Isha, because out of Ish, this one was taken. Do you hear the connection? Isha, of course, is the Hebrew for woman, and now the word Ish is used. Again, so that you hear the pun, but also that's what the story says. Now, it has been said traditionally that the woman is secondary to the man because, for several reasons. Number one, because she is created secondly. You cannot say that in Genesis 1. There is no succession of creation in Genesis 1. Male and female, he made them. All right? But you can't say that she was the second one. Does that make her secondary? She is secondary to man because she comes from the man. She comes from his substance. Therefore, she is derivative. Now, you may not have heard those words, but that's how we grew up understanding women, and of course, the Bible tells us so. Let me just say that if we're going to interpret the creation of woman in that way, then we should also interpret the creation of the man in that way. Which means she comes from the man. That makes her secondary and derivative. He comes from dirt, and that makes him secondary and derivative. We never translate that way. Okay, so you see the bias of the translation. And so much of what we understand anthropologically is really a biased translation not found in the text. In no way am I suggesting that the ancients did not have a gender bias. Of course they did. Their society was structured patriarchally. They inherited patrilineally, and they usually lived patrilocally. You lived with the husband's family, not with the wife's family. Though some societies were matrilineal or matrilocal, but Israel was certainly very, very male privileged. Very male privileged. And much of the theology today that has to do with the church's understanding of women is based on, the Bible's Old and or New Testament understanding of the society that produced the text, not contemporary society. And, and it's not disloyal to say much of our theology in terms of feminism is far behind what it should be. To say nothing about our theology that has to do with integrity of creation. The church's theology is way behind. But everybody's theology is way behind there. So again, it's an example of how our theology changes. It must change if we are going to be faithful to the insights that we have, the insights that are ours. So talking about interrelatedness, we're made of the same stuff. These are beautiful stories that talk about how intimate we are with everything else made. Bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, intimacy. In the last 2 verses of this particular chapter, therefore the man leaves his father and mother. That's something. In a clannish society, to leave your clan means something. You don't just do that. That's why when Jesus tells his disciples, leave your mother and your father, he is asking an awful lot more than was asked of us. Because in our society, everybody leaves their father and mother. They just go to a different place. But in a society, strict clan, you don't leave your society. You become adjacent, but you don't leave your society, and that's why you make sure you don't leave your society. You live with them. It just gets bigger and bigger. But what it says, you leave the society, they become one flesh. The intimacy there. And we should understand that not simply, as genital intimacy, but the intimacy with another creature. The intimacy with another creature. The longing of every human heart is to be able to look in the eyes of another creature, another human being, and know that you've been known. And are we not fortunate that we have had that, all of us, somehow or other, parents, friends? And what does that mean? What do we recognize when we look at another person? If you've had a pet, a dear pet. I grew up when I was a little child with my father's dog as a member of our family, my father's dog that he had as a young man. And his name was Nero, and when Nero died, we all grieved. Who grieves for animals? And the answer, of course, is anybody who knows what animals are or can be. We should grieve. We should grieve for extinction. We should have been very concerned that the wolves were run out of Yellowstone or that the bees were becoming extinct. Now, naturally, many animals or creatures become extinct naturally, but it happens within nature, and things then are in some ways balanced. But when we become responsible because of our greed, because of our thoughtlessness for the extinction of another animal, we are upsetting our ecosystem. That's the interrelatedness. We are part of an ecosystem. Again, all of this is magnificent insight that we have, but always threatened by the fact that somehow along the way it all goes to our head, to use contemporary language. Now, we do much of this out of ignorance. But once we have insight, there's no excuse for extinction. There's no excuse for, what we have done to land. There is no excuse for what we have done to air. Not simply that it poisons us, it does. But remember, we are connected to everything. And what poisons us, poisons earth. And what poisons earth, poisons us, because we are all one. That is the interconnectedness that the Holy Father is talking about. And we laugh and we talk about tree huggers. That is our brother. That is our brother. That is our sister. Go again to the prayer of St. Francis, and you will discover interconnectedness. The passion that drives us is the fire that he's talking about. And again, there's a little book, The Universe is a Green Dragon. Lovely little book that talks about the forces in human beings and human existence. Where do you suppose we got them? From the natural world. They weren't just, we were like a cup opened up and then dropped in from heaven. All these dynamic forces. For example, he speaks about gravity as allurement. What attracts you to people? What attracts you to nature? Did you see the sunset last night? And if you saw it, did you stop and look at it? And if you didn't, what a shame. But if you did, why did you? What were you waiting for? What did you think was going to happen? If you sit at a lake, and just sit at a lake, why? Why waste your time, some would say. What is that allurement? It's the same allurement that he says we find in gravity. Now, gravity is maybe not as poetic as that kind of allurement, but you know what I'm talking. We've all had those experiences. Why do we make flower gardens? Why do you bring flowers in? It just causes more work. Ask the sacristans. But why? Because it's beautiful. What does beautiful mean? Why is beautiful important? All of that is the natural world of which we are a part. We express it differently. But Brian Swimme, in that book, The Universe is a Green Dragon, he goes through many things like that in a very simple way, in a very poetic way, and speaks about, the dynamic, the forces within human beings. The question is always, where do you suppose that came from? Where? Somehow or other, it comes from the world of which we are a part. Not simply the world in which we live. Though we do. But we live in the world in the same way as my hand lives in my body. And we don't use that kind of language. Because my hand doesn't live in my body. My hand is my body. Is a part of my body. Not the whole, but a very important part. See, even our language belies what we see as separation. Separation. One last thing. If we're all interconnected, how then do we understand resurrection? Now, interconnectedness is the scientific fact. Physical interconnectedness is the scientific fact. Resurrection is a theological belief. When we talk about the resurrection of the body, what are we talking about? And if the body is part of the natural world, are we resurrected and everything else is left behind? Because in a certain sense, if we are resurrected, we are the natural world. Again, Paul says, all of creation is groaning in labor pains. All of creation. We find in the prophets, and we find then in Revelations, a new heaven and a new earth. What does that mean? There are many. Now, obviously, nobody really knows because nobody's been there and come back and told us what happens to the earth. But there are many, many theologians today who really believe that some kind of transformation of the entire cosmos takes place. We use the language, the cosmic Christ. You cannot use that language if you do not believe that somehow or other he is part of the cosmos. Or if not he part of the cosmos is part of him. There is no separation anymore. I'm sure that's what the writers are saying when they use that language. It's not simply that, he has left Earth and now is up in heaven. That's the cosmos. That kind of thinking is maybe 4,000 years old. But we've come beyond that. So when we talk about interconnectedness, whatever we do affects everything. Just like whatever we eat affects our entire body. You cannot say to one part of your body, now don't worry about this. I know you don't like it. I mean, it's ridiculous. And yet sometimes we act as if that's what's happening with us in terms of the cosmos. So when we talk about interconnectedness, when we look at this story, this is only the story of creation of earth. This is not the story of creation of the heavens. Because the farmers were not interested in that. This is a much earlier story than the first creation narrative, even though it is second in place. That was the decision of the editors. But this story talks about the interrelatedness of everything on earth. Okay? We know today it's not just earth. It is our solar system. Because our solar system, all of it came from the Big Bang, made of the same stuff, whatever that stuff was. So we shouldn't be surprised if we find elements out in space, or on the moon, or on Mars, very much like we find elements on Earth. The issue is whether or not we find water. Because water suggests the possibility of life. But that interconnectedness, we're part of all of that, you and I. And when you think about it, we can't even use the word puny. There is no word puny enough to use to say how significant scientifically we are in this whole vast, how significant we are on Earth is difficult to talk about. To say nothing about how insignificantly scientifically we might be in the solar system or in the universe. And yet, that is the creature that reflects God as an image. An insignificant creature. All right? So, that's the image of God. Here we have the image of God in interrelationship with the rest of creation. Every one of us must be reintroduced to our brothers and sisters. Or if not reintroduced, introduced for the first time. I constantly think about that young Hawaiian girl who every morning stood in front of the ocean and said, thank you. Recognizing how interdependent the ocean and her life were. Every one of us must somehow capture the realization of how interconnected we are with the rest of the universe. And in the midst of all of it, we are in a special way chosen by God. Talk about privilege. That's the privilege. That's the privilege that we are. And being, that's what we are.